This is not my natural voice. This is my coughing voice. Satan and Randy Weingarten don't want me to give this speech. But I have been prayed for. Having been around the world regarding education, I hold this invitation to the Educators Summit to be among the pinnacle experiences. I've done 10 lectures at Chautauqua Institution to a very hostile audience. I one time was third fiddle at a particular institution. They had invited Alexander Solzhenitsyn, they had invited Malcolm Muggeridge, and they settled for Bruce Lockerbie. I could hardly have had a higher honor. Yes, there are a few books in the lobby, and I'll be back there to meet with you and talk with you. We also have a publication called the Paideia Letter, and there are a few copies of that if you care to pick one up. And so, I recall as a sixth grader in my school choir in Michigan that we sang a song about an oversized clock and its role in marking almost a century of an old man's life. You remember the tune and the text? 90 years without slumbering, his life seconds numbering, but it stopped short, never to go again when the old man died. I'm now that old man. I married a child bride. We had our 66th wedding anniversary last week. And for her, she's endured. And I've come to this Educators Summit for a particular purpose, to challenge, inform, and encourage you to consider faith-based schooling. In preparation, I went through my old files and I found the text of a speech I gave 60 years ago at Barnard College in New York City. I'd been asked to speak about the particular role of a teacher of literature and his own character in teaching the great texts. And I came upon a phrase in that speech. I must have said, "I don't teach only what I know. I teach who I am." Teaching who I am. To do that successfully, I must adhere to both the Greek maxim at Delphi, know thyself, and its many biblical parallels requiring not only a daily self-examination, but also an awareness of a penitential sensitivity to God's knowledge of who I am and his ultimate purpose for my life, which is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And such self-knowledge demands humility that transcends my teacher's own moral and intellectual example of virtues. I have to know that the origin of those virtues lies beyond one's own subjective values. Knowing who I am, therefore, affects my understanding of the art or science I profess to teach. Knowing who I am enables me to ascend to the heights once common among educators. How far removed is this old-fashioned sense of mission. Now discouraged as theocratic rant or dangerous and unworthy of 21st century woke agendas, instead of striving to reach its acme, our profession has settled for the degraded gutters where so many schools and teachers debase themselves. We have left the mountaintop of theology and idealism, hopefulness, and international respect represented by the great names in the history of education: John Amos Comenius, John Eliot, the Grimke sisters, William Holmes McGuffey, Frederick Douglass, Marva Collins, and other leaders in past generations. Instead, we have settled for the psychological and secular humanist dung heap of Dewey, Skinner, our current Secretary of Miseducation, Cardona, the Unionist agitators, and their ilk. And we have reached the nadir when they transformed schools and colleges from bastions of free discourse and debate into purveyors of propaganda in behalf of race, class, gender. As the Los Angeles preacher E.V. Hill has often said, there are a lot of isms that ought to be wasms. So then, if I am teaching who I am, and that's my educational philosophy, who am I? By God's grace, I have now spent more than 65 years in the vocation of Christian schooling at all levels, K-12, college, university, seminary. I remain committed to a Christian paideia taught and lived by someone called to teach, meaning that my instruction intends to offer glimpses of what Frank E. Gabeline called the unity of all truth under God. This is the biblical foundation for a Christian paideia, and its cornerstone is the sine qua non, the without which nothing. And here is that: no faith-based schooling without faith-grounded teachers. Many of you have come to this event, I suppose, having read Battle for the American Mind. I have it here somewhere. Co-authored by Pete Hegseth and David Goodwin, who is CEO, president of the Association of Classical Christian Schools. If so, if you have read this book, then you are a whole lot better informed about Christian paideia than I was at your age. Born and reared in a godly home, I was a Baptist preacher's kid, I nonetheless came to adulthood and to the profession of teaching knowing nothing whatever about a Christian paideia. Even after 8 years of high school and college Greek, I didn't really know the word beyond its definition by Socrates. If you ask what is the good in general of paideia, education, the answer is easy. Paideia makes good men, and good men act nobly. That is, of course, the principle behind compulsory education in our society. If we can civilize the little barbarians, perhaps they won't grow to become bigger barbarians. I was aware that St. Paul uses the word throughout his letters, but I didn't make the application. I didn't take the model of his imagery. My formal education from primary grades through graduate school was exclusively in public and secular institutions taught by men and women who had decided that they knew what I needed to know. And their methodology seemed mostly to consist of instilling alleged facts to be memorized and recited by me. Let me make it clear, I don't object at all to memorization and recitation. In fact, it's one of the essentials of the classical curriculum. I used it in my own classrooms, and when some teenage, what shall I call him? A nice word. What's the nice word I can find? Well, I'll use the same word again. Some youthful barbarian would say, why do I have to memorize this stuff? I learned to say, and you may use it with not only permission but welcome, your parents have commissioned me to be the interior decorator of your soul, and I am hanging beautiful tapestries on the walls of your memory. And then I might add added, now go memorize because I'm going to grade you on it. My own schooling was thoroughly classical but weighted against contemporary studies. By ninth grade, my course consisted of English, history, Latin, Greek, French, and Spanish. I read the ancient myths as a key to understanding most of the major works of British and American authors, all of whom seem to have died and left no successors. I learned and relearned the saga of Western culture from the Egyptians to the Greco-Roman civilization, then on to European exploration. I regret never having made a chronological entry into the 20th century. I had even less exposure to mathematics and science, leaving me curious but mostly illiterate in those fields of knowledge. I was reared in a culture and emotional atmosphere marked by perpetual fear of catastrophic attack. My teachers, classmates, and I were all fixated on seeing our existence through the lens of a belligerent world and life view, which I would describe as us against them. We were living in the era of the greatest international tension between Western democracies and the twin enemies of fascism and socialism. Churchill, Roosevelt, in league with Stalin, opposed Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo. Then Truman, MacArthur, Eisenhower, and the United Nations faced down Stalin, Kim Il-sung, and Mao Zedong. And later came the false security of peaceful coexistence and perestroika. To comfort us, my public schooling included heavy doses of civil religion, such as daily classroom Bible reading and recitation of the Lord's Prayer, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance and a stanza of either the national anthem or some other patriotic song. I have vivid memories of school assemblies showing the latest newsreel films of the London Blitz or the D-Day invasion of France as a means of stirring school children to help the war effort. On one memorable occasion in my Ontario, Canada school, I sang a boy soprano solo for Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. She was in exile with her daughter Juliana in the city of Guelph, Ontario. I sang for her, "There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see." And the Queen, when I finished, patted me on the head and said, "I hope so soon." Before any television news anchors, we listened over dinner to the radio broadcasters who, we were assured, were telling us the full and unvarnished truth about our allies conquering our arch enemies. But we never examined how to understand such international belligerence through the lens of Scripture and our Christian faith. Arriving at New York University in the early 1950s, and that's another story, my most memorable professors were identified with New York City's intelligentsia, former supporters of the Spanish Civil War and its revolutionaries who had been opposed by Hitler's fascist goons. Most of my professors had become disillusioned by Stalin's peace pact with Hitler, betraying their dream of a socialist utopia replaced by the gas ovens of Auschwitz. The allure of socialism did not diminish even after the oppressive rise of the USSR and the Cold War throughout Eastern Europe. My strongest memory of campus life during my freshman year in Greenwich Village, New York City, at New York University, is not pep rallies for sports, but protests in Washington Square Park or in Union Square by faculty and students offended at the arrest, trial, and eventual execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, spies accused of giving atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. The course of my life changed profoundly upon graduating from NYU when I was offered a teaching and coaching position at Wheaton College in Illinois. I accepted and also enrolled in graduate courses in biblical studies, my first exposure to Christian schooling. The new environment represented a united commitment within the governing board, administration, and faculty to a professed faith in Jesus Christ, abundantly evident as voluntary prayer in the classroom, communal worship by faculty and students, common biblical references as occasion might call, and most dramatically, students already conscious and responding to a call by God, and so preparing themselves for such a vocation. Yet I must confess that even in such a rarefied evangelical atmosphere, I had absolutely no grasp whatever on the model of a teacher whose paideia is formed or being formed within the framework of a biblical world and life view. I didn't know those terms myself. Nonetheless, I criticized their inescapable implications, often visible in ineptly pious teaching, what I would describe as tacking a godly tail on a secular donkey. And so I avoided, to the best of my intentions, teaching a Shakespearean sonnet or the Great Gatsby from a biblical worldview. All of that changed when I met and entered into the mind of Frank E. Gabeline, founding headmaster of a school this year celebrating its centennial, the Stony Brook School, Long Island, New York. The foremost pioneering statesman in Christian schooling throughout the 20th century. If you are considering the call of God to a Turning Point Academy school or any other professed Christian school, I urge you to read Gabeline's seminal book, never out of print since 1954. I wish I could say that about some of mine. The book is The Pattern of God's Truth, The Pattern of God's Truth, in which he creates the well-known phrase, which needs to be attributed to him, the well-known phrase, all truth is God's truth. This is the book. He was no mere educational theorist and administrator. He was a trained concert pianist. He was an alpine mountaineer, a self-trained theologian, editor of biblical commentaries and other publications, co-chair of the 1957 Billy Graham Crusade in Madison Square Garden, chairman of the English Style Committee of what you and I know as the New International Version, the NIV Bible. What we read is what Gabeline and his committee thought made the best English prose. And later in his life, he walked with Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama, and served as pastor, counselor, Bible teacher to senators and members of Congress. When he offered to become my mentor, I gladly accepted his tutelage, and he began by taking me through this book and how it had developed in his own experience. Because of him, who passed me on then to others steeped in scriptures, I was able to learn how a teacher might identify the truth of God's word embedded in, not sprinkled on, but embedded in the academic subject at hand. He taught me to understand what St. Paul and Justin Martyr and Augustine and John Calvin and Abraham Kuyper mean when they talk about taking captive every thought. From him I learned the power of the declaration by Desiderius Erasmus. All studies are for this one object, that we may know Christ and honor him. This is the end of all learning and eloquence. Gabeline introduced me to the French mystic and martyr of World War II, Simone, we say while, the French say way, who urged us all to regard all of learning as access to a higher plane of spiritual experience. She describes how a geometry problem becomes a little fragment of particular truth because it is a pure image of the unique, eternal, and living truth, the very truth that once in a human voice declared, I am the truth. And she concludes, every school exercise thought of in this way is like a sacrament. When you stand in your classroom, do you believe that you are engaged in a sacramental act with your students? He and I discussed what Albert Camus may have meant when he addressed a group of Dominican nuns and said to them, what the world expects of Christians is that Christians should speak out loud and clear in such a way that never a doubt, never the slightest doubt can rise in the heart of the simplest man, Albert Camus. Surely, these historic and major thinkers and writers were calling for Christian teachers to step forward, unashamed of the biblical worldview that introduces the mind to the wholeness of God's truth. And so, by the grace of God and in time, I became one of those teachers whose long-term lesson planning searches for any reasonable and practical application of biblical truth as it might be revealed. But even more important, praying the night before the next day's classes that God will give me the flexibility, the wit and wisdom to respond to the question I didn't expect from a student I didn't expect, and be able to help guide that questioner to the wholeness of God's truth. In short, I became committed to teaching who I am, not merely what I know. In another era, that was common. Teacher and pupil climbed together, aiming for the highest peak, joined in uncompromising academic integrity and rigor. I know something about that. I was the College Board's first consultant promoting the Advanced Placement Program. I helped to introduce the International Baccalaureate curriculum to American schools. And here's a confession. For many years, I tormented teenagers on Saturday mornings by having composed, written the verbal analogy problems on the Scholastic Aptitude Test. All of that is gone. The Advanced Placement Program is an exercise in woke curriculum. The International Baccalaureate curriculum is deemed to be too rigorous, too hard, too stiff. And ETS, Educational Testing Service, decided 5 years ago that nobody thinks in verbal analogies anymore, and so we'll drop them from the SAT. The same kind of criticism can be launched at the historically church-sponsored schools, especially the East Coast preparatory schools. Two renowned Episcopal educators speak to this point. The late Tony Jarvis, longtime head of one of the oldest schools in America, Roxbury Latin School, founded by a missionary named John Eliot in 1645. Tony Jarvis wrote, "Christ was the foundation of every one of these church schools, founded to introduce students to Jesus Christ." And another late friend named John Westerhoff described the state of too many Episcopal schools when he said to Laurie and me over dinner, "We ought to have said to our clientele, 'Welcome to our table. Of course, your presence does not change the menu.' We have changed the menu." So then, where are you called today, and what are you called to do? Public schooling in all forms has been co-opted, as we well know, by political influence and godless immorality. Private schooling is not far behind. Today, both public and private schooling are being roiled by the deception of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or dogmas called critical race theory, and the perverse advocacy of physical gender confirmation surgery imposed on children without their parents' knowledge or consent. The exception to such educational bedlam, led by the current breed of deluded fanatics, will be the very schools that Turning Point Academy intends to found or redeem. Into this period of moral decline and academic collapse steps Turning Point Academy and its purposes expressed as Christian, classical, conservative, church-based, and cost-affordable. I support these principles, and more important, I support the people who espouse them. I invite you to consider how you too may join in such a worthy venture to restore American education by reaching toward the summit to which this conference aspires, and God willing, before this old-timer's clock stops ticking. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.